Vampire the Masquerade was released in 1991, and I was exposed to it very early in 1992, and so played a little bit of first edition, but focused more on second edition as it was released later that year. What you're looking at here are the collector's editions of Revised, the so-called third edition of Vampire the Masquerade, and I got them while here in South Korea. In the dying days of 1997, I hauled my carcass off to Korea to spend a year, maybe two, and toward the end of that first year, these editions began to be released, and so I bought them in anticipation of returning home and returning to the great fun that we had had for the preceding 6 years for our extended World of Darkness campaign. That didn't actually happen, as it's more than 20 years later, and I'm still here, but these volumes have seen their uses here, although not as much as I expected when I bought them, because it was this edition that convinced me it was time to step away from White Wolf and the World of Darkness, that I was going to have to continue with, let's say, my take on the World of Darkness based on the attitudes of earlier editions and the system between second and revised didn't matter so much, but it was just what did I want to read in the text, and that's something that will be the core part of this video. We'll be looking at really what has been the nature of these releases, the nature of the text, as new writers, new blood are brought in to make changes, to update, to fix, to improve, to address things which seem to be problematic. If there's anything that has been true about each edition of Vampire the Masquerade and its subsequent games, it's complaints and commentary. Maybe about the art. We're looking here as the art book for the revised edition, or about the system, or about the setting, or about the politics, or about the way it talks to people, or about the way it tries to model events in the real world, or the way it says it's going to do one thing but is actually doing another, where it's pushing you toward the narrative yet providing you with tools for deep and detailed and systematic modeling of ugly reality. The books, I used them around the table and soon became cautious. They did not seem like they would handle use well, and as you can possibly hear, they don't handle disuse well either. And so I take them down every once and again to give them some play, but at the same time prefer to use the PDF. But if you look at these pages, you see that they were very carefully laid out to be readable. There isn't too many instances of things lurking behind the text. The columns are straight and justified. Although these books were produced before digital versions of game books were the norm, they are far easier to use on digital devices than a lot of modern games with more elaborate and, frankly, often frustrating layouts. This is an example of a bad page with a lot of images, salted in behind the text, but generally speaking, it's a very legible product that is organized in a very coherent way that, especially if you are already a player of a World of Darkness game, would be second nature to you to navigate. While we cannot say that the system itself was coherent in the way that it operated with how the game presented itself to its players, meaning that, as we said before, it's pushing toward what they're calling the narrative, but without providing you with the tools to really work toward a narrative, instead providing you with tools to, as we said, model reality or their fictional version of reality. All of this is wrapped up in a package of a variety of different types of art, some of it legitimately provocative, some of it childish, some of it intentionally shocking, some of it confusing. And As this is something based in taste, we had different people liking different things. White Wolf was trying to expand beyond its initial core of people who responded to the musical quotes, who responded to the references to popular media, and instead luring them in through other means. Gone is the simple cover, unless you get these collector's editions. Everything becoming more and more garish, everything becoming more and more graphic, with just enough hints back to the older, less explicit, more suggestive imagery, iconography, and text of the earlier editions. We had reached a point like now where people were taking over the line and putting their own stamp on it, putting their own reactions to it. Plus, the game had been out for so very long that there were so many different takes on it, so many different reactions to it, so many different interpretations of what was there. All right. This is a game of personal horror, say people, completely ignoring the type of statistics and mechanics which are presented on this screen that I'm showing you now. People saying this is a game of superheroes with fangs, ignoring all of the atmosphere with which the game cloaked itself. On both sides, we have people misinterpreting the game. We have people choosing to play something different from what is being suggested in the core book. And so then we wind up with something like the Storyteller's Handbook. And for all of the bile and the negative reaction to how Vampire 5th Edition speaks to people when it calls out particular types of people, this book from Revised is no different. It is very pejorative and attacks people for being not smart enough to play. There's page after page after page listing problem players, which you don't even have to read between the lines. It's saying dumb people are not invited and you need to get them out of your game. They're the problem. And then it has this very small text box saying, hey, if someone's legitimately suggesting physical harm or inappropriate physical behavior, you really need to get rid of them too. So there's many, many pages of how to deal with the person who they think isn't smart enough to play your game, and this tiny little text box saying, hey, don't play with strangers, or don't accept candy from people in the backs of vans. I mean, there has always been the problem of this being risque, right? There has always been the problem of dealing with suicide, with death, with disease, with sexual adventurism, or whatever you want to call it. It's very difficult, especially with the way Vampire was written from the beginning. It's very, very difficult to separate it from the idea of blood drinking is in some way a metaphor for sex. And then to fill up the pages with suggestive art linking all kinds of different sexual orientations or predilections, plus the alien nature of things once we enter into the realm of the Sabbat, there are all kinds of triggers that are going to make some of the players uncomfortable, upset, or lead to conversations that younger players might not want to have with older players, etc., etc. It has always been something that was requiring a careful touch for mature players. But did mature players actually play it? Was it really in the hands of people who were prepared to handle it, who had the requisite education and intelligence and attitude and buy-in that would produce a game of personal horror, that were willing to take the mechanics they were given and force them into the mold of storytelling, of crafting a narrative together about a fall, about the choice between human morality and bestial hunger? Is that what Vampire ever was? These are important questions, I think, that long-term players of Vampire need to address, and those who have only heard about it in passing need to consider. has the game radically changed? Well, in some ways, Vampire the Masquerade has, in its 5th edition, taken steps to, pardon the word, embrace the idea of hunger and more fully put it into the mechanics in a way that will matter, not that just might matter if people choose to actually engage with the whole game as presented. It will, if played in the spirit in which it's presented, provide the tools necessary to create that vampiric experience or that struggle. Unlike with Revised, where there was an effort made to bring all the threads together into a coherent package to address the major complaints with the system that people felt were important, to build on a foundation and, as we said before, add a personal stamp to what vampires are and how everything ties together in the world of darkness. In 5th edition, there can be a cleaner sense of a reboot. The things that we know about the Sabbat, the things that we know about the Camarilla, about the Anarchs, about the time of Thin Blood, about the Elders, everything has been reset to a certain amount. Although, because this is very much an edition which seems heavily inspired, heavily emulating the original material, more and more of this old material is likely going to creep in. And that means that a lot of the old archetypes are likely to show up, while we have many years of complaints about sword-wielding vampires or superheroes with fangs or all of the unnecessary gun violence in what is supposed to be, a gothic punk environment. We have only to look at the art in the books. We have only to look at the clan templates provided by the game writers themselves. We have only to read their fiction stamped into every available space in the older editions to see where a lot of the problems came from. They came from the game itself. People were just playing what was suggested. And yet, we're being criticized throughout for doing so. This mixed message we're already also seeing in the 5th edition, possibly because the people writing for it are simply emulating the sections of the book which came before, cribbing from it like a high school student doing their homework. It's hard to say. And we also have the issue ahead of us of White Wolf being dissolved as an independent creator and its properties being licensed out to third parties, such as Modiphius, who haven't handled Vampire before other than in production, and companies which we are more familiar with handling the World of Darkness, like Onyx Path. What are these companies going to do with the 5th edition of Vampire? Are they going to keep on keeping on, or are they going to take the opportunity to reboot and redo, trying to get closer to the themes and match the system with the themes? Right now, we have no idea. This is a period of flux for the game. What is going to happen? Looking back through all of these old books is reminding me again and again how surprising it could be to hear what the advice was in the Storyteller Handbook compared to what the system actually does for you. To read the fiction and hear these attitudes and hear these reports, which of course must be from unreliable narrators, because you're not going to be able to replicate what they're talking about with the system unless you choose to fudge the dice or not engage it. So with efforts made to make the 5th edition match more carefully its subject material, I do have some hope about it. But as we will talk about in a subsequent video about the actual mechanics of the system, they have cribbed from so many different sources. The question must arise, why don't I just play this setting using another system? Because for all intents and purposes, that's what the new Vampire system is. It's using another system. But we'll get there. Now, I imagine that gamers of my vintage looking back at these books are feeling similarly to I do, that these are familiar. This is what a vampire book looks like. Black and white, clear text, bars of imagery, black and white imagery, Tim Bradstreet, that sort of thing. I imagine they're saying, yeah, this is what Vampire should look like. But if Vampire 5th edition is going to differentiate itself, if it's going to be a different game, if it's going to hew more closely to the idea of a beast I am, lest a beast I become, if it's going to actually try to do that mechanically and, in a sense, enforce it narratively, then one of the best places to start is by revamping how it looks, to choose to completely upset what we expect. Not 2 columns, but 3 columns. Not black and white, but color. And for all the opinions that get thrown around about how things look and should look, ultimately something like aesthetics is, for the most part, subjective. So while I thrill to how the 5th edition, collector's edition, or limited edition looks, I know that there are people who are excited about how the standard edition looks and find this to be boring or old-fashioned or stodgy or whatever, or not worth the price. Although I have to say that the quality of this book compared to the collector's editions from 1998 and revised is significantly higher. It is much heavier. The page quality is much more dense, and the book is much better bound. I think this book will be with me longer than they have been, and I'll be able to use it with less care required. I think that's an important consideration. But while this is a strength of Modiphius, handling the text is not, or at least they don't have the best track record in this regard. We've seen this throughout the 2D20 lines, and now they're going to be taking on a line like this. Now, this book is fairly well put together in terms of its consistency as a system. It still needed more work presenting it in a consistent tone so that there was enough examples for each concept to provide comfort for new players. But as we said in the original video, it's pretty good. But where it is weak, again, is in proofreading. There are numerous mistakes pretty much everywhere through it, which we cannot reliably expect Modiphius to catch, as they have, like I said, a track record of not doing so. So while they can give us inspiring looking pages, high quality art, they have excellent grasp on production schedules and getting things where they need to go logistically. They can give us books that look like this. In the end, we have to be able to read them. So again, beyond what are the companies going to do with the system, there is how are they going to manage and support and encourage and develop their writers. These are questions that, as of yet, I haven't seen an answer for. I have seen Modiphius and other companies like Chaosium talking about their editing and layout and how much care are going into them, likely in response to the rise in complaints about the quality in those areas. But the proof is in the product. So, what will the products be? So someone coming to the game for the first time, or an old hand who's sitting on stacks of books like I do, might be saying, I'm not ready to get involved in this game yet. And there are other options out there if it has whetted your appetite for vampire play. There are games like Feed, which is a game specifically engineered to enable you and your group to create a role-playing game around any kind of vampire that you like. You design the vampire strains together, and then you go forward with games focused around things that matter to the characters as characters. If you're interested in a game of personal horror, you might find that it's easier to get there with a vehicle like this. It's up to you. It's not very many pages to read. It's not very expensive, and it's an interesting experiment in considering the vampire beyond just the imagining of what someone else wants you to portray a vampire as. Here, you're in control. So as we look at the dawn of the 5th edition of Vampire, we have to remind ourselves, we have to rip through the nostalgia, we have to parse through our specific memories of how we played the game to look at what the game really was. And it has always spoken with an attitude, whether that was trying to communicate its setting to us through the words of the original writers and to share their passion for certain music and fashion and ideas and questions and philosophies and problems. The tone of that attitude changed. Instead of railing against society, it began to rail against how people were playing the game, how people were misinterpreting what was written, especially when it wasn't written very clearly or well. No one likes to be criticized. We understand how frustrating it can be to find that your words are not understood. It takes a thick skin to put up with that with grace and not give in to the goading. And as we look at this new edition with its new authors and its new owners, they haven't had the time to develop that skin. We can see the reactions. We can see things being said and then being backed away from. We can see sections of the text that have had elements added to them, first praising a type of behavior or suggesting a type of behavior as an interesting element to explore in a mature horror game, and then backing away from it. The inconsistent tone of do this but actually don't do that, and think this but actually don't think that, scattered throughout the text almost as a band-aid solution to what was produced. If there has been this much of a lack of control over the text at this point, what is ahead of us in the future? It's for these reasons why I say I don't think the game had enough time in preparation. It wasn't ready for release, and while there are some excellent ideas contained within, we, the players, will have to work hard to bring them to the type of dark luster that is appropriate for Vampire the Masquerade. So, is it salvageable? It is if we salvage it. What is ahead for it? We don't know. Like previous entries in the World of Darkness, I fully expect the game to take a stand against behaviors and attitudes which are truly vile. At the same time, I expect it to not take a stand against behaviors and attitudes which, while they might be dangerous or lead in some way to possibilities for harm, will appeal to the target audience. And at the same time, I expect the game to follow fad and fashion. Ultimately, this is a business, and the messages which get appended at the beginning and ends of books, while they might ring of truth, they might not reflect a consistent or even coherent moral compass. These are game books about a supernatural world full of human and inhuman horrors. They are set up to put us in a position where we can examine the horrors that we do and why we do them. Not to become better at them, not to embrace hatred and violence, but instead to embrace the higher aspects of what it means to be human. In its past, the game has pointed the finger, has called out, and has criticized a variety of different people while supporting others. If this new edition has changed for you, if the finger has now swung around to be pointing at you, the question to ask might be, why? If previous targets of that finger did not bother you, why does this one? Why is it unfair when that finger points at you? I think we can all do with a little self-examination from time to time and put ourselves in the context of the present, but also in the context of the past, and see if we are actually moving forward in progress in ways that help everyone, or if we are instead seeking in some way to protect aspects of ourselves, be that ego or be that some fading dream of who we really are. If our self-reflection cannot stand the withering glare of sunlight, then we, like the metaphorical vampire, deserve our fate to be dissipated and dispelled on the wind as ash. Vampire is a game of personal horror. It's looking at our dark side, dragging it out into the light, and being willing to understand that this is not what we should encourage, that the violence, that the betrayal, the lies, the backstabbing, the political positioning, the use of force over those who are weak, the vilification of the other, the walking through the world as if we are of it while seeking to control it and make it serve us. All of these things are the dark side of us, and they do not deserve to come with us into the future. Vampire, for all of its bleakness, was ultimately a game of hope that you could find Golconda. But that quest had to at least begin with searching for it. Beyond that, the quest for humanity itself, a state of redemption from the damnation that even in a game as opposed to religion as Vampire, being a vampire surely and unequivocally was. It might be that this version of Vampire, that the versions of Vampire that came before it are not up to the task of putting this quest of self-reflection, of personal horror into your hands, but as our characters, as fledglings, first foray out into the night, seeking with their still human perceptions to minimize the harm that they do, and then as they are slowly eroded until they realize, as older vampires in horror, what it is that they have slid away from and what it is that they are sliding toward. Like them, we can assess ourselves, if not as the point of play, but as an excellent byproduct of play. And if we look at this game and we can no longer see ourselves in it, we must ask why. Have the references left us behind? Are the faces no longer our own? Does the fashion leave us cold? Does the sense that these are mere copies of copies of copies weigh us down? Is it the difference of system that things just can't stay the same? Well, ultimately, that is the metaphor, isn't it? That we live long enough not to see ourselves cast as the villain, but to recognize our own villainy. And, if we're lucky, be able to withstand that recognition. The next video in the series will look at system. We'll look back over Storyteller to see what has changed for the better, what has simply changed, and where some of these changes have come from, ultimately identifying which system Vampire 5th Edition hews most closely to now. So, until next time, farewell.